Okay, this one's for Ideist again. Well, first I'd like to point off, I wasn't selectively listening, okay? I invite you to point out any key point that you made, and if you would be willing, I would like to know what minute and second you made a point that I did not respond to that was critical. Yeah, I don't think I was selectively listening. I tried to hit every major point. I tried to understand every major point too. My ad hominem, as you call it, in the notes section or whatever you want to call it of my video. Well, it's not an ad hominem fallacy, so it doesn't particularly bother me, and it's no more. It would be an ad hominem abusive, which it's no more abusive than your general tone in this debate. That's fine though. I am not sensitive, but I would point out that you are a deist, and you are making the fine-tuning argument. That puts you in the camp of the intelligent design cats, as far as I know, as far as I'm concerned. What I would really like to respond to is your response to the question. At last, you answered, I find. You may have answered it earlier, but I didn't hear it. I almost missed it in this one, because it came out as a string of gibberish. I mean, you were talking numbers, and numbers always come out as a little bit, well, they come out a little gibberishy, so it's really not your fault. But I almost missed it. So let me restate your argument as I understand it. You were saying that the dice do not compare to the fine-tuning argument because it's not just a question of where the values fall, but it's also a question of their relationship to one another, their ratios. So the dice would work for the individual values. For the cosmological constant, for example, one of many, it would have a die that could represent it, and it would have 10 to the 120 faces on it. It would be a big damn die with a hell of a lot of faces, but it would. That's a perfectly fair way to reason through it. In fact, it is the most basic way of understanding probability, is to think of a fair die with the number in the denominator as the number of faces. So, anyways, but you throw on another constraint, and you say, okay, well. The relationship of the cosmological constant to the mass of the electron and the force of gravity, each of which have their own die with their own colossal number of faces, that ratio has to be a certain thing. And you seem to think that this makes for a qualitative difference between that scenario and the scenario of the 25 D6 roll, because there are no such constraints on the 25 D6 roll, right? There is no demand that they be in a certain ratio. But this argument fails. Actually, you haven't affected the probability at all. Upon further reflection, it occurs to me that you haven't changed the probability at all. What you've done effectively is to define the scenarios in which we would call a particular roll a success. This is like the royal flush argument, the royal flush thing, because the constraints actually see if you roll the dice, the permutations which cover all of the ratios that you're talking about, all those permutations are already in the body of possibility. Okay, the ratio, the relationship of the various dice to each other. It's a constraint in a sense, but it actually does not affect the probability in any way. There are still only so many possibilities. You have X number of values, X number of dice basically, and each die has a certain number of possibilities associated with it. And those are the individual probabilities. For the cosmological constant, for instance, it's 10 to the 120. You have a die with 10 to the 120 faces on it. So, yeah, asking, okay, so what are the odds that each of these would have the particular ratio that they would? Actually, what you've done is made it a little bit simpler, because if you were just talking about a ratio, there are many values which will give a particular predetermined ratio. So it's no longer a question of this one having exactly this value and this one having exactly this value. It's a question of all of them having values, various values, which in effect have a particular relationship that you've defined. So you're actually working backwards. You're making the probability, you're making the scenario is more complicated, but the probability itself is higher. So ultimately, it fails on two counts. A, it brings the probability involved closer to the 25d6 roll, and B, you still fail to draw a qualitative distinction. There is still a discrete probability associated with the system you've described, with the scenario you've described. And there is, of course, a discrete probability associated with the 25d6 roll. Again, as I pointed out a couple of times now, I don't know how you would determine discrete probabilities for the physical constants, but you accept them, and so I'll argue it within that framework. Yeah, at the end of it all, after setting your constraints and rolling your 40 or so dice with billions upon billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of faces each, you still have a discrete probability, which means it is still comparable to the 25d6 roll. It's a simpler version of it, sure, but that's trivial. You still get a discrete probability in both cases, and they are still both pretty large. Many magnitudes of order larger in the case of the fine-tuning argument, but not so much larger that they represent a qualitative difference. So anyways, I appreciate you responding to the question, but it's not actually a response. It does not delineate between the probability associated with the fine-tuning argument and the probability of the 25d6 roll. And it never answers how you can reasonably make an inference of intelligence or influence from a remote probability. So let's see here. That was chiefly what I wanted to respond to. If you'd like to respond again, assuming I haven't convinced you that the 25d6 roll is a fair analog, I expect another response. Unless you're getting bored with this. Okay, yeah, you talk about the probability of getting a royal flush being very remote, but what would you think if you got 10 royal flushes in a row, or the probability of getting hitting the lotto versus the probability of hitting the lotto 52 weeks in a row? Well, if I hit the lotto 52 weeks in a row, you're right. And while there is a remote chance, an extremely unlikely probability that I would actually win the lotto 52 times in a row, it's actually zero because I don't buy lotto tickets. But the probability that I would hit the lotto 52 times in a row is so remote that I would not suspect it was the case if I did, that I had done it fairly. Of course, I would not infer necessarily that a person had influenced the outcome of the lotto in my favor. There are other explanations too. There could have been a computer glitch, could have been any number of things. There are a slew of possibilities which could explain it without having to inject intelligence into the back end of the scenario. Same goes with the royal flush. While there is a dealer, and he would be the immediate target of my suspicion if I got 10 royal flushes in a row, it could also have been someone could have mistakenly handed him a pinochle decker, or one could have been packaged incorrectly at the factory or something like that, and we would all be playing with face cards. So an extremely remote, an extremely unlikely outcome does not suggest necessarily an intelligent influence. So that's my chief problem with this argument from improbability made by intelligent design proponents. So that's that. Would I be suspicious? Yes. Would I conclude intelligent design? No. Let's see. Was there any other? Oh yeah, you mentioned something about calculating the probability of the Earth falling into the orbit that it did, and falling onto the knife's edge, basically. And you call it statistically impossible. Yeah, I'm a bit mathematically minded. I would like to know what you mean by that, because as far as I know, the phrase statistically impossible means nothing. Anyways, I think I responded to everything I wanted to respond to. If there was something that you said, oh yeah, you mentioned something about, it's not that I didn't hear the word cohesive. I didn't understand it the way you expected me to understand it, but I did understand the fine-tuning argument before you mentioned it. I didn't realize that you thought the complication of the constraints that you've added, the ratio of the values, was what you thought divided one probability from another. And if I've gotten you wrong there, set me straight. Ultimately, though, I still think that you failed to differentiate the two categories of probability. Oh, and one more thing, I suppose. You have not demolished any probabilistic argument of mine. I haven't made any probabilistic arguments. I have only been arguing that arguments from improbability, which include an inference of intelligence or influence, external influence of some kind, don't work. I suppose that's it. So, Godless Heathen signing off.